I knew meeting up for coffee with a stranger was always a gamble, but nothing prepared me for this. The moment he walked through the door, I should have known something was off. He scanned the room like he owned it, then spotted me at the corner table. I raised a hand, nervous but polite, and he beamed like we were old friends. At first, I thought, okay, maybe this will be fine. He seems nice enough. Oh, how wrong I was. The first clue came the second he opened his mouth. "Hey," he boomed, loud enough to turn every head in the shop. Heads turned. Conversations paused mid-sentence. Even the barista froze mid-pour. I smiled awkwardly, hoping no one would remember this moment for long. Surely he'll settle down once we start talking, I thought. Surely. But no. He didn't have an inside voice. He didn't even have an outside voice. He had a megaphone. "So, how long have you lived in the city?" he asked, as though I was standing across a field instead of sitting 2 feet away. People stared. Someone at a nearby table stifled a laugh. My ears were already ringing, and we hadn't even ordered coffee yet. "I just moved here last year. It's so different from my hometown." I chuckled nervously and tried lowering my voice, hoping he'd mirror me. "Oh, that's cool. I've been here for a while now," I said, just above a whisper. I was practically begging the universe for him to follow my lead. But he didn't. "Oh no," he doubled down. "Oh yeah? What do you do for work?" he bellowed, like we were in a stadium instead of a cozy cafe. I flinched. The entire shop didn't just overhear, they heard. Some people outright gawked. A couple at the next table leaned in like they were listening to a live podcast. I mumbled, desperately wishing I could disappear. "I work in marketing," he interrupted, yelling louder than before. "That's cool. My friend tried that once, but it sucked for him. Do you like it?" My soul left my body. I leaned closer, practically crawling across the table to hiss. "Could you, maybe lower your voice a bit?" But he didn't even hear me, or he ignored me. Instead, he barreled forward, oblivious to the fact that my face was burning and I was whispering like I was hiding state secrets. "I mean, you probably make good money, right? Is it enough for rent? I heard this area's super expensive." I glanced around. Kill me now, I thought. People weren't just glancing anymore. They were openly staring, some trying to suppress laughter, others watching like this was a live sitcom. I hadn't felt this much secondhand embarrassment since middle school. Desperate, I grabbed my coffee cup and muttered, "Let's take this outside." I was already halfway out the door before he caught on. Anything to escape the audience, I thought, practically sprinting to the sidewalk. Finally, he joined me, still grinning, completely unfazed. "So what's up?" he asked, voice still booming. "Why is he still so loud? We're literally outside." I took a deep breath, channeling every ounce of patience I had left. "Hey, so, I don't know how to say this, but you're really loud. Like really loud. I'm kind of uncomfortable, because everyone in there was staring at us." He blinked, surprised, then shrugged. "Oh yeah, people tell me that all the time." "Wait. What? People tell him this all the time? So he knows he's loud? And he just chooses to keep doing it?" My brain short-circuited. I stared at him, trying to process this. "Oh," I said finally, my voice flat. What else could I say? My patience evaporated like a puddle in the desert. "Well, maybe you should work on that." He laughed, as if this was funny. As if my humiliation back there in the cafe was a joke. "Yeah, I guess. Anyway, where do you want to go next?" Where did I want to go next? Away. Far, far away. I plastered on a fake smile and said, "You know what? I think I'm going to call it a day. But, nice meeting you. Good luck with everything." And with that, I walked away, heart pounding, ears still ringing from his voice. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. His voice echoed down the street behind me as he called out, "Bye. Great meeting you." Later, as I replayed the whole nightmare in my head, I couldn't decide if I was more horrified or amused. I mean, who doesn't have an inside voice? And if you know you're loud, if people have told you this multiple times, how do you not do something about it? I told my friends about it later, and they couldn't stop laughing. "Oh my God," one of them said, wiping tears of laughter from her eyes. "You met a human foghorn." Another chimed in, "You're lucky you got out of there." Imagine being stuck on a road trip with him. They were right, of course. The whole thing was funny in hindsight. But in the moment, it was a horror story. A coffee shop catastrophe I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. I should have trusted my gut the moment I noticed the tan line on his ring finger. But no, I told myself to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he just forgot to take it off while tanning, I thought. Maybe he's divorced. Maybe I'm overthinking. Spoiler alert, I wasn't. That tiny, innocent tan line was just the beginning of a night that spiraled into something out of a psychological thriller. We met at this trendy bar downtown. The kind of place that's all dim lighting, exposed brick, and overpriced cocktails. He walked in, sharp suit, confident stride, and a smile that was just a little too perfect. He seemed polished enough to sandpaper over the warning bells in my head. When he sat down, his cologne was just subtle enough to seem tasteful, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he'd drowned in it on purpose, like he was trying to cover something up. I just didn't know it yet. "So, what do you do?" I asked casually, sipping my drink. "I'm head of security at this big multi-million-dollar corporation," he said, leaning back with an air of practiced confidence. The words dripped out like he'd rehearsed them in the mirror 100 times. "It's intense work, but someone's got to keep things safe, right?" I nodded, trying to seem impressed, but something about the way he said it felt off. "My friend's husband is actually head of security for a major firm, and I know how he talks about his job. The jargon, the pride, the details, it's like second nature to him." "This guy?" He was vague, almost too smooth, like he'd memorized a job description off LinkedIn and hoped I wouldn't ask questions. Still, I let it slide. Maybe he was just trying to sound impressive. Maybe I was being paranoid. But then came the next red flag. "No kids," he said, smiling over his whiskey. "Never been married either. Just haven't found the right person yet." I raised an eyebrow. "Really?" He laughed, leaning forward like he was sharing a secret. "What? You don't believe me?" I shrugged, playing it cool, but something about the way he said it felt rehearsed. Like he'd delivered that line before, probably to more people than just me. I wanted to believe him, but my gut wasn't buying it. And then when he went to pay the bartender, I saw it. His wallet slipped open just enough for me to catch a glimpse of the photo tucked inside. A family portrait. A woman, a little boy, and him, smiling like they were the picture of happiness. My stomach dropped. My throat tightened. He came back, oblivious, flashing that same fake smile. "So, what's your next drink?" he asked, like nothing had happened. Like I hadn't just seen what I saw. I froze for a moment, then forced a smile. "I'm good for now." My voice came out tight, barely audible over the pounding in my ears. My mind raced. Who was the woman in the picture? His sister? A friend? No. That tan line. That portrait. That lie about no kids. It was all starting to add up, and I didn't like where it was leading. But I wasn't done yet. I wasn't going to let him off that easily. "So," I said, trying to sound casual, "head of security, huh? My friend's husband does that too. What kind of stuff do you handle?" He hesitated, just for a split second, but it was enough. His confident facade cracked, and for the briefest moment, I saw the wheels in his head spinning, scrambling for an answer. "Oh, he said, waving a hand like it was no big deal. "Overseeing operations, managing a team, that kind of thing. That kind of thing? My friend's husband has told me about his job before, and trust me, it's not just that kind of thing. It's detailed, specific, and intense. And this guy couldn't even fake his way through a basic conversation about it." I smiled, pretending to be impressed. Inside, I was boiling. Why lie? Why weave this ridiculous web of nonsense when the truth was probably less complicated? And more importantly, why lie to me? The rest of the night was a blur of him rambling about his job, his single life, and how he was looking for someone real. I played along, nodding and smiling, but my mind was elsewhere. I kept replaying everything in my head. The tan line, the photo, the flimsy answers. It was like piecing together a puzzle where every piece screamed, "This guy's a fraud." Finally, I'd had enough. "Hey," I said, cutting him off mid-sentence. "I actually need to head out. Early morning tomorrow." He looked surprised but recovered quickly, flashing that too-perfect smile again. "Oh, of course. Let me walk you to your car." I didn't want him anywhere near my car, but I nodded, keeping the mask on. The walk to the parking lot was awkward, his small talk grating on my nerves like nails on a chalkboard. When we reached my car, he leaned in like he was expecting a goodnight kiss. I stepped back, my voice steady but firm. "Look, I don't think this is going to work." His smile faltered. "What? Why?" I paused, debating whether to call him out or just leave it at that. But I couldn't help myself. "You're married, aren't you?" His face went pale. For the first time all night, he was speechless. And that was all the confirmation I needed. I shook my head, disgusted. "Good luck with whatever this is," I said, getting into my car and locking the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't stop shaking. Not from fear, but from anger. How many other people had he lied to? How many other women had fallen for his fake charm and fake life? The thought made my skin crawl. When I got home, I told my friend everything. She was horrified, especially when I mentioned the head of security lie. "That's so creepy," she said. "Why would he even lie about something like that?" I didn't have an answer. All I knew was that I'd dodged a bullet, or maybe a whole firing squad. And even now, I can't help but wonder, who was the woman in the photo? His wife? His ex? And did she know what kind of man she was dealing with? The theater was pitch black, and the movie had already started by the time I made it back from the bathroom. My heart was pounding, partly because I'd been so excited about this date, and partly because I was already second-guessing everything. This was one of my first ever dates, and I'd spent the entire day hyping myself up to make sure everything went perfectly. So naturally, I was a ball of nerves as I shuffled awkwardly back to what I thought was my seat. The theater was crowded, the kind of pack that makes every row feel like a maze. I fumbled my way through the darkness, murmuring apologies as I squeezed past people, and finally found what I was certain was my spot. I eased into the seat, trying not to draw attention to myself, and glanced at the silhouette next to me. I couldn't see much in the dim glow of the screen, but I thought I caught a glimpse of her hair, the curve of her profile. "That's definitely her," I told myself, settling in and trying to relax. The movie was a blur. I barely paid attention, my mind racing with nervous energy. Should I say something? Try to hold her hand? Or would that make things weird? I kept glancing at her out of the corner of my eye, my heart skipping every time I thought she shifted closer. But something felt off. She wasn't laughing at the funny parts or reacting to the intense scenes. She didn't even seem to notice me. Maybe she was just really into the movie, I thought. I didn't want to overthink it, so I sat there trying to convince myself that everything was fine. It wasn't. When the lights came up at the end of the film, I turned to say something to her, only to realize that the girl sitting next to me wasn't my date at all. My stomach dropped like I'd missed a step on a staircase. She looked at me, confused, and then glanced at the guy on her other side, who also seemed baffled by my presence. Panic surged through me as I scanned the rows in front of me. There she was, 2 rows ahead, sitting exactly where I'd left her, looking around as if trying to spot me. The realization hit me like a ton of bricks. I'd been sitting with complete strangers for the entire movie. I don't even know how I missed it. Maybe I was too nervous, too caught up in my own head, to notice that I'd sat in the wrong row. Or maybe I was just so preoccupied with not embarrassing myself that I'd somehow managed to embarrass myself in the worst way possible. The girl I'd accidentally sat next to gave me a small, awkward smile before turning back to her date, who was clearly trying to figure out what was going on. My face burned as I mumbled a quick apology and practically tripped over myself getting out of the row. I could feel everyone's eyes on me as I made my way down to where my actual date was sitting, but I didn't dare look up to confirm it. She turned as I approached, her expression a mix of confusion and mild amusement. "Where were you?" she asked, trying not to laugh. I stammered something about getting lost in the dark, but my face was so hot I could barely string a sentence together. I thought I was sitting here," I said, gesturing vaguely toward the row I'd just vacated. Her laugh was kind, but I could feel the second-hand embarrassment radiating off her. "You sat with another couple?" she asked, raising an eyebrow. "Apparently," I muttered, wishing I could disappear into the sticky carpet of the theater. We walked out together, and she was nice enough not to tease me too much about it, but the damage was done. I replayed the moment over and over in my head, cringing at how clueless I must have looked. The worst part was knowing that the couple I'd sat next to probably spent the entire movie wondering who the hell I was and why I'd planted myself in their row like I belonged there. Even now, years later, the memory of that night makes my stomach twist. It wasn't just the embarrassment of sitting in the wrong seat, it was the sheer absurdity of the situation. I'd been so focused on making a good impression, so worried about messing things up, that I didn't even notice I'd messed up in the most spectacular way possible. Looking back, I can laugh about it, kind of, but in the moment, it felt like the end of the world. I mean, what's more horrifying than realizing you've spent an entire date literally sitting in the wrong place? It was like something out of a bad comedy, except I was living it, and the punchline was my complete and utter lack of awareness. To her credit, my date was a good sport about it. We didn't end up going out again, but I like to think it wasn't because of my theater faux pas. At least, that's what I tell myself. But the whole experience taught me one valuable lesson. Sometimes, the scariest thing about dating isn't the fear of rejection or the awkward silences. It's realizing you've accidentally been in the wrong place the entire time. I sat on the edge of the hotel bed, staring at the clock. The red numbers glared back at me. 9:47 p.m. He was supposed to be here hours ago. I'd been pacing the room for what felt like forever, texting and checking my phone every few minutes. The messages started casually enough, asking if he was close, but by now, I'd stopped bothering. The last reply I got was almost laughable. Heading your way soon. Left the game early for you winking face. Oh, how lucky I was. To be fair, the build-up to this moment had been nothing but good vibes. We'd been chatting on Tinder for weeks, 6 to be exact. Every day, without fail, there were messages, jokes, memes, late-night banter. When we finally met in person a couple of weeks ago, it had gone really well. The chemistry was electric, the kind that made you think, wow, maybe this is actually something. So when he suggested making a weekend of it, splitting a hotel room since he lived a couple of hours out of town, it felt like the natural next step. But now, sitting in this half-empty hotel room, the thrill of anticipation had been replaced with the cold sting of reality. He wasn't here. He'd rolled into town late, hours late, and instead of heading straight to the hotel, he'd gone to meet up with his friends. At the footy, the FODY. I couldn't help but replay his words over and over in my head. Left the game early for you. He said it like he deserved a medal, like this grand sacrifice of leaving his mates and a pint a little early was proof of his devotion. By the time he finally arrived, it was just past 10 p.m. The door creaked open, and there he was, all smiles, casual as if nothing was wrong. Hey babe, he said, tossing his bag onto the chair like this was the most normal scenario in the world. You should feel special, you know. I've never left a game early for a girl before. Oh, my God. I just stared at him, too stunned to even reply at first. Special? I was supposed to feel special because he dragged himself here 3 hours late after hanging out with his friends instead of keeping his word. The audacity of it all was almost comical. Almost. Wow, I said finally, my voice icy. What an honor. He either didn't catch the sarcasm or chose to ignore it because he flopped down on the bed next to me, acting like he'd just won boyfriend of the year. Yeah, the guys couldn't believe it, he said, laughing. But I told them, this girl's different. Different? Sure, I was different. Different enough to deserve being stood up in my own hotel room while he lived it up at a football game. Different enough to hear about how lucky I should feel for being someone's sloppy second priority. I took a deep breath, trying to calm the storm raging inside me. Part of me wanted to scream at him, to demand why he thought this was okay. But another part of me, cooler, quieter, more detached, realized something important. This wasn't just a bad night. This was a preview, a glimpse into how he operated, how he saw other people. Did you have fun? I asked, my tone dangerously even. He grinned. Yeah, it was great. I mean, it's always a good time with the boys, you know? But I knew I had to get back here for you. Like I said, I've never done that for anyone before. I laughed, but there was no humor in it. Wow, I said again, standing up and grabbing my phone. You're really laying it on thick. His grin faltered. What do you mean? I turned to face him, finally letting the mask drop. I mean, you're acting like leaving a game a little early is some huge romantic gesture. Like I should be falling over myself with gratitude that you even bothered to show up at all. He blinked, clearly not expecting the shift in tone. Well, I did come, didn't I? 3 hours late, I shot back. After hanging out with your friends. You didn't even text me to let me know what was going on until I asked. Do you have any idea how disrespectful that is? Now he was on the defensive. Oh, come on. It's not like I bailed. I just wanted to see my friends first. You're overreacting. Overreacting. The classic line. I almost laughed again. Right, I said, grabbing my bag. Because expecting basic decency is such a high bar. He sat up, frowning now. Wait, what are you doing? Leaving, I said simply. You can have the room. I'll book somewhere else. Wait, seriously? He asked, like he couldn't believe it. You're really gonna throw a fit over this? I paused at the door, looking back at him one last time. It's not a fit. It's a boundary. Enjoy the rest of your night. And with that, I was gone. As I stepped into the elevator, my heart was racing, a mix of anger and relief flooding my chest. Part of me wondered if I'd overreacted, if I should have stayed and tried to talk it out. But deep down, I knew the truth. This wasn't just about the game, or the hotel, or the tardiness. It was about respect, or rather, the complete lack of it. The ride home the next morning felt lighter somehow. Sure, I was disappointed. It sucked to realize someone you had chemistry with wasn't who you thought they were. But there was a strange sense of empowerment too, knowing I'd walked away instead of settling for crumbs. I swear, it started out like any other date. You know, that mix of nerves and hope that maybe this time, it'd be different. I met him on Plenty of Fish, seemed like a decent guy. His profile was clean, no weird vibes, nothing that screamed run for your life. We'd messaged back and forth for a couple of weeks, and he seemed normal enough. Funny even. So when he asked to meet up for coffee, I thought, why not? We picked a quiet cafe, somewhere neutral, just in case things got awkward. I showed up a little early, sipping my latte and scrolling through my phone, trying to play it cool. When he walked in, he looked fine. Average. Nothing alarming. He was polite, had a nice smile, and even complimented my sweater. The first 20 minutes were easy, small talk about work, hobbies, the usual icebreakers. But then, out of nowhere, the conversation took a turn. I have to be honest about something, he said, leaning in. His tone dropped, serious now. I froze mid-sip, my stomach nodding. Okay, I said slowly, bracing myself for the classic. I'm separated but not divorced, or I live with my mom. You know, the usual red flags. But no. What came out of his mouth was so far beyond anything I was prepared for. I just got out of San Quentin, he said deadpan. I was in there for 20 years. For a moment, I thought I misheard him. San Quentin? 20 years? My brain scrambled to make sense of the words. My throat felt tight, like I couldn't swallow. Oh, I managed to choke out. What were you in for? I don't even know why I asked. Curiosity? Fear? Some misplaced sense of politeness? But the answer nearly stopped my heart. Double murder, he said, so casually it felt like he was telling me about his favorite Netflix series. It was a long time ago, though. I've changed. I couldn't breathe. My hands felt clammy, and my pulse was pounding so loud in my ears I could barely hear him. My mind was screaming, get out, get out, get out now. But my body wouldn't move. I was paralyzed by this mix of fear and disbelief, stuck there across the table from him. He kept talking like it was nothing, about how it wasn't his fault, how the justice system was flawed, how he'd found himself in prison. He even mentioned joining some art program while he was inside. You'd be amazed what you can create when you've got 20 years and nothing to do, he said with a smile that sent chills down my spine. I nodded weakly, every fiber of my being begging me to leave, but I didn't know how. I didn't want to set him off. I didn't want to make him angry. All I could think was, this man has killed before. What if he decides tonight's my night? I forced myself to keep it together, plastering on a fake smile and nodding along to his stories. I wasn't even processing half of what he was saying anymore. My brain was in survival mode, screaming at me to stay calm, to act normal, to not give him any reason to suspect I was terrified out of my mind. The date dragged on, every minute feeling like an hour. I sipped my coffee just to have something to do, my hands trembling so badly I nearly spilled it. He didn't seem to notice, or if he did, he didn't care. At one point, he reached across the table to touch my hand, and I had to fight the urge to pull away. My skin crawled under his touch, but I didn't dare show it. When he finally said he needed to leave, I practically leapt out of my chair. Yeah, me too, I said, forcing a laugh that felt hollow in my throat. We walked outside together, and I kept a careful distance, praying he wouldn't suggest walking me to my car. Thankfully, he didn't. He just smiled, said he'd had a great time, and asked if we could do this again. I nodded, the words spilling out of my mouth before I could stop them. Sure, I lied. Let me know. The moment he walked away, I bolted to my car, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might explode. My hands were shaking so much I could barely get the key in the ignition. The second I locked the doors, I broke down, tears streaming down my face as the adrenaline finally crashed over me. When I got home, I didn't even bother taking off my coat. I went straight to my phone and blocked his number. Then I changed mine completely. I deleted Plenty of Fish, scrubbed my social media, and spent the next hour triple-checking that my privacy settings were airtight. Even now, weeks later, I still feel a cold chill every time I think about that night. About how close I was to someone capable of something so horrifying. About how easily I could have become another statistic. I don't know if he was genuine about turning his life around, and honestly, I don't care. What I do care about is how I ignored every instinct, every red flag that screamed danger, because I didn't want to seem rude or overreact. Never again. If there's one thing I've learned from this, it's to trust my gut. Because sometimes, it's the only thing standing between you and the kind of nightmare you don't wake up from. The dim glow of the bar's neon sign flickered in the window as I checked my phone for the 10th time. 7:32 p.m. He was officially late. My gut told me to call it and leave, but I brushed it off. He's probably stuck in traffic, I told myself, trying to be patient. We'd been talking for a week, and he seemed like a decent guy. Divorced, a dad in his 30s, someone who'd get the importance of showing up on time. When he finally strolled in, nearly 30 minutes late, I gave him the benefit of the doubt. That was mistake number one. Sorry about that, he said, flashing me a smile that was just a little too confident for someone who'd kept me waiting. Without missing a beat, he flagged down the waitress and ordered a beer and a shot of Fireball. Then he turned to me with an almost rehearsed grin. You want one too? I hesitated. A shot and a beer on a Wednesday night wasn't really my thing, but I didn't want to seem uptight. Sure, I said, forcing a smile. He clinked his shot glass against mine, and I braced myself as the cinnamon burn hit my throat. At first, the conversation was fine. He was chatty, maybe a little too chatty. Words spilled out of him like a dam had broken, and no matter what I said, he interrupted me. Compliments flew like confetti. You're so smart. You're gorgeous. I love the way you think. Nice, sure, but they came so fast and so often that I couldn't even finish a thought. Every time I tried to steer the conversation somewhere meaningful, he'd bulldoze right over me. But the real red flags started piling up with the drinks. By the time he was halfway through his third beer and second shot, I was already eyeing the clock. He wasn't slowing down. Another round? He asked, signaling the waitress before I could even respond. Maybe we should order some food, I suggested, hoping to sober him up a bit. Burgers arrived, and for a brief moment, I thought things were stabilizing. Then he chased his meal with yet another shot and 2 more beers. By 9:30, he was buzzing hard, talking even faster, slurring just enough to make me uncomfortable. Meanwhile, I nursed my second beer, counting down the minutes until I could politely call it a night. When the check came, I grabbed my bag, hoping this was the end of it. But as we walked toward the exit, the waitress came running after us. Hey, she called, glancing nervously at him. Are you driving tonight? You've had a lot to drink. He scoffed, waving her off. I'm fine, he said, his words a little too sharp. I have a high tolerance. I didn't even drink that much. The waitress shot me a concerned look, and I felt my stomach twist. Maybe you should order an Uber, I said, trying to keep my voice light. Just to be safe. I'm fine, he insisted, his tone more insistent now. Then he leaned in closer, the smell of Fireball and stale beer heavy on his breath. But hey, I was thinking, maybe I could come back to your place. The alarm bells were deafening now. I have to work early, I stammered, taking a step back. He looked hurt, almost weepy, and before I could react, he leaned in, trying to kiss me. I turned my head just in time, mumbling something about next time, and darted to my car as quickly as I could. I never heard from him again, and trust me, I didn't lose sleep over it. I have another story to tell. I mean, if I thought that date was bad, the next one came with a whole new level of unease. This time, it was a paramedic, divorced, good-looking, and fresh off a long shift. We met at a quiet diner, and I was cautiously optimistic. He seemed normal enough when we first sat down, but as the meal progressed, things started to unravel. It started innocently enough, small talk about his job, his kids. But then he brought up his ex-wife. At first, it was the usual venting. Things didn't work out, they fought a lot, co-parenting was hard. But then his tone shifted, and the things he said, they weren't just bitter. They were dark. She's bleeding me dry with child support, he muttered, stabbing at his fries. I'd love to hire someone to take care of her. You know what I mean? My heart stopped. He laughed, but it wasn't the kind of laugh that made you feel at ease. It was cold, humorless, and the way he looked at me afterward, like he was waiting for me to agree, sent a chill down my spine. I forced a smile, my pulse racing. That sounds really hard, I said carefully, trying not to escalate the situation. Every instinct in me was screaming to get out of there, but I didn't want to make him angry. I didn't want to be the next person he casually wished violence upon. After that, the conversation stalled. He picked at his food, occasionally muttering about how unfair life was. I nodded along, pretending to listen, all the while planning my exit. The second the check came, I practically threw my card at the waitress, eager to end the night. Outside, I mumbled something about having an early morning and walked to my car as quickly as I could. He didn't try to stop me, didn't even say goodbye. He just stood there in the parking lot, staring at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. I drove home in silence, my hands gripping the wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. The whole way, I kept replaying his words in my head. I'd love to hire someone to take care of her. It wasn't a joke. I could feel it in my gut. He meant it. Like the first guy, I never heard from him again. And honestly, I'm glad. But those nights stuck with me. Not just because they were bad dates, but because they reminded me how quickly things can go from awkward to downright dangerous. Now, every time I agree to meet someone new, I double-check my escape plan. Because sometimes, you don't know who you're sitting across from until it's too late. I almost canceled. Sitting on the edge of my bed, phone in hand, I debated sending the "hey, something came up" text. He seemed too young for me, and even though I was only in my early 20s, the gap felt bigger than it should. But he'd insisted he was my age, swore up and down that he wasn't some clueless kid. Against my better judgment, I agreed. When he pulled up to my place, my jaw nearly hit the floor. A sleek, shiny sports car purred in my driveway, like something out of a music video. I wasn't sure whether to be impressed or suspicious. My friends had joked earlier, he's either a drug dealer or has rich parents, and staring at the car now, I wasn't so sure they were wrong. He stepped out, looking just a little too polished, his smile so bright it almost felt practiced. "Ready to go?" he asked, his voice casual, but I caught the slightest hint of nervousness. I climbed into the car, inhaling the scent of new leather and a faint trace of cologne. The ride was smooth, and dinner was fine, pleasant but dull. He wasn't rude or obnoxious, just boring. I found myself filling the silences more than I liked, and every now and then, I'd catch him glancing at his phone like he was waiting for something. Something about him felt off, but I pushed the thought away. Maybe he was just shy. Maybe I was overthinking. We headed to a movie after dinner, and I told myself to give him the benefit of the doubt. Maybe he'd loosen up. We got our tickets and settled in, but not even 10 minutes into the previews, his phone buzzed. He pulled it out, barely trying to hide it, and started texting. I frowned, annoyed but not wanting to make a scene. The movie started, and he was still glued to his phone, the screen's glow lighting up his face in the dark theater. Then, without warning, he stood up and left. I watched him go, confused, but figured maybe he was taking a call or something. When he came back a few minutes later, his face was red, his eyes puffy. He'd been crying. "Are you okay?" I whispered, leaning closer. "I'm fine," he said quickly, avoiding eye contact. His voice cracked just enough to give him away, but he tried to brush it off. "If you need to leave, it's okay," I offered, genuinely concerned. Maybe something terrible had happened, his grandma, a family emergency, something serious. But he shook his head. No, it's fine," he insisted. He wasn't fine. The movie continued, but he barely stayed in his seat for another 10 minutes before disappearing again. I sat there, increasingly uncomfortable, watching the rest of the film by myself. Every now and then, I'd glance toward the lobby doors, hoping he'd come back, but he didn't. When the credits rolled, I grabbed my bag and made my way out, wondering if he'd ditched me entirely. There he was, standing near the concession stand, phone pressed to his ear, pacing in tight circles. His shoulders were tense, his face twisted in frustration. I walked up, motioning for him to wrap it up. He gave me a pained look, holding up a finger like just one more second. Finally, after what felt like forever, he ended the call and turned to me, still visibly upset. "What's going on?" I asked, my patience wearing thin. He hesitated, then sighed, his voice breaking as he admitted, "I've been arguing with my friend. And my ex." My stomach dropped. "What?" "My friend's trying to sleep with her," he said, his words spilling out in a rush. "She was on the phone too. I was trying to get them to stop." I blinked, stunned. Was this real? I had so many questions I didn't even know where to start. Why are you even involved in that?" I asked carefully. He ran a hand through his hair, his voice shaking as he explained. "It's complicated. We broke up after some stuff happened." He hesitated, then added, "I had to go to rehab. She posted some bad things about me online. That was it. That was the explanation." Rehab? Bad things online? None of it made sense, but by now I was so exhausted, I didn't even want to ask. My head was spinning, trying to piece together this chaotic puzzle he'd just dumped in my lap. He drove me home in awkward silence, his mood swinging between sullen and teary. I kept my answers short, not wanting to dig deeper into whatever emotional minefield I'd stumbled into. When we pulled up to my place, he gave me a weak smile, clearly hoping for some reassurance. "Thanks for tonight," I said, my voice flat. I got out of the car before he could try to say more. As I closed the door behind me, I leaned against it, exhaling the deepest sigh of relief. The whole night felt surreal, like some twisted fever dream I'd accidentally walked into. I replayed it in my head, trying to make sense of it, but the more I thought about it, the stranger it seemed. I never heard from him again, and honestly, I didn't want to. The weirdness of that date lingered with me for weeks, though. The way he cried in the theater, the frantic phone call, the vague mentions of rehab and drama. It all felt like a storm I narrowly avoided being swept into. At least the movie was good. The wine bar was packed. Music thumped in the background, conversation buzzed at an unbearable pitch, and I could barely hear myself think. I leaned against the wall, arms crossed, trying to stay polite while my date chattered away. Except, I couldn't understand a word he was saying. The place was so loud, it was like he was talking underwater. I kept nodding and smiling, pretending to catch bits and pieces. But honestly, I just wanted to get out of there. He leaned in closer, probably thinking that would help, and before I realized what was happening, he kissed me. Not a sweet, tentative first date kiss. Oh no, this was sloppy, wet, and so uncoordinated it felt like he was trying to eat my face. I froze, stunned, while he kept going, oblivious to how uncomfortable I was. His hands didn't wander, thankfully, but the kissing was so bad it didn't even matter. People brushed past us, and I was pressed up against the wall like I was in some awkward teen drama gone horribly wrong. After 5 excruciating minutes, 5 minutes that felt like 5 hours, I pulled away, faking a yawn. "I'm so sorry," I said, summoning every ounce of politeness I had left. "I'm really tired. I think I need to head home." He looked disappointed, but I didn't care. I mumbled something about early mornings and bolted for the door. The night ended there. I went home, threw on my comfiest pajamas, and buried the whole cringe-worthy experience in the back of my mind. Weeks passed, then months. I had all but forgotten about the bad date. He didn't message, and I didn't care. Life moved on. And then, out of the blue, his name popped up on my phone. I stared at the message for a moment, half tempted to delete it without reading. Curiosity got the better of me, though, and I opened it. "Hey, I've been thinking, and I just don't think we're sexually compatible." I blinked. Once. Twice. Then reread it. Was this guy serious? We went on one date. One. And the only thing close to sexual was his attempt at the world's worst kiss. I rolled my eyes and started to type a sarcastic reply, but before I could hit send, another message came through. My daughter, though, she's an adult now. She can have sex with whoever she wants. It's amazing how open she is about it. She tells me everything. My blood ran cold. I stared at the screen, horrified. Surely I'd read that wrong. Surely this grown man, this father, wasn't casually discussing his daughter's sex life with me, a relative stranger. But there it was, in black and white, like some awful punchline to a joke no one asked for. He didn't stop there. The messages kept coming, each one worse than the last. He went on about how proud he was of her freedom and how refreshing it was that she felt comfortable sharing those details with him. I wanted to throw my phone across the room. Every word made my stomach churn. What kind of person says things like that? To someone they barely know, no less? I felt dirty just reading it. It wasn't just creepy, it was disturbing. This wasn't just an awkward overshare. It was something darker, something that made my skin crawl and my hands shake as I stared at my phone. I didn't reply. What could I possibly say? Any response felt like engaging in a conversation I desperately wanted no part of. Instead, I blocked him, deleted the messages, and tried to shake off the deep unease clinging to me like a shadow. But the encounter haunted me. I kept thinking about that wine bar, about the way he kissed me like he was entitled to it, about the way he'd messaged me months later, like he had some kind of twisted authority over my body, my worth. And then there was the way he talked about his daughter, so casual, so vile. It was as if he couldn't see how wrong it was, as if he thought he was being open-minded or progressive instead of horrifying. I wondered about her, his daughter. Did she know what he was saying about her? Did she trust him with her private life, only for him to turn around and exploit it in conversations with strangers? The thought made my heart ache. I imagined her as some sweet, naive person who thought she could confide in her dad, never realizing he was twisting her openness into something grotesque. And then, of course, there was the darker possibility. What if she wasn't confiding in him? What if he was making it all up, constructing this sick fantasy in his head? Either way, it made me sick. Either way, it made me wish I'd never swiped right in the first place. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, his words replayed in my mind, like some grotesque whisper I couldn't shut out. I kept picturing his face, the way he looked at me that night at the wine bar, the way he seemed so normal. I thought about all the other people he might have dated, all the other women who might have sat across from him, completely unaware of what lurked beneath the surface. And then there was that one terrifying thought I couldn't shake. What if I hadn't excused myself that night? What if I'd let him come closer, let him into my space, into my life? I shuddered at the thought, grateful for the instincts that had told me to run. The air in the bar felt heavy that night, like something was off before I even walked in. My gut told me to cancel the date. Something about her profile had seemed too good to be true. But I figured, what's the worst that could happen? Famous last words. She waved me over as I walked in, and for a moment I froze. My stomach dropped. The woman sitting at the table looked nothing like the pictures on her dating profile. I'm not talking about a subtle difference, no clever angles or flattering filters. No, this was outright deception. She was easily 100 pounds heavier than her photos suggested. I stood there, caught between disbelief and a vague sense of annoyance. Still, I told myself to be polite. I'd already come all this way, and maybe I could salvage the evening with some decent conversation. I plastered on a smile, walked over, and introduced myself. "Hey, nice to meet you." She grinned back, oblivious to my shock, and launched into small talk like nothing was wrong. I sat down, still trying to process the situation, when she flagged down the bartender and ordered a drink. On my tab, of course. The first few minutes were awkward but manageable. I kept the conversation light, asking about her interests, her job, anything to fill the silence. But then she started talking, and that's when things took a nosedive straight into the twilight zone. Within the first 30 minutes, I learned more about her than I ever wanted to know. First, she casually mentioned that she was married. Yes, married. She said it like it was no big deal, like it was just another fun fact about her life. My brain screeched to a halt. "Wait," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "You're married?" "Oh yeah," she said, waving a hand like it was nothing. "But don't worry, he's in prison." I blinked. "Prison?" "Yeah," she said, sipping her drink. "He's been locked up for a while now. I mean, it's not like we're really together anymore, you know?" I didn't know. I didn't know anything anymore. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what she'd just told me, but she wasn't done. Not even close. "And I'm doing so much better now," she continued, her voice picking up speed. "I'm 12 days clean from heroin." Heroin. My stomach flipped. 12 days. That's not even 2 weeks. I stared at her, unsure of how to respond. Was I supposed to congratulate her? Offer support? I was still stuck on the fact that her husband was in prison. "Oh, and I have 3 kids," she added, almost as an afterthought. "But, they're in the system right now." The system. My brain short-circuited. I felt like I was watching a train derail in slow motion. Every piece of information she shared crashing into the next. Married. Prison. Heroin. The system. Each revelation was like a punch to the gut, and I could barely keep up. She kept talking, oblivious to my growing discomfort. Her words blurred together as I sat there, trying to figure out how I'd ended up in this nightmare. This wasn't just a bad date. This was a full-blown horror story. The kind you tell your friends about later, and they don't even believe you. I glanced at my watch, trying to come up with an excuse to leave. But she was so deep into her story, some convoluted tale about her husband's crimes and her struggles to get her kids back, that I didn't know how to interrupt. I just nodded along, barely listening, my mind racing for an exit strategy. Finally, she paused long enough for me to cut in. I said, forcing a smile, "I just realized I have an early morning tomorrow. I should probably get going." Her face fell, but she recovered quickly. "Oh, okay," she said, looking disappointed but not surprised. I reached into my wallet, pulled out a $20 bill, and handed it to the bartender. "This should cover my drinks," I said, loud enough for her to hear. I didn't offer to pay for hers. Not after everything she'd just dropped on me. As I stood up, she looked at me, her expression a mix of hope and resignation. "So, do you think we could do this again sometime?" I almost laughed. "I'll let you know," I said, avoiding eye contact as I walked out the door. The cool night air hit me like a slap in the face, and I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the lingering unease. My heart was pounding, and my hands felt clammy. I couldn't believe what had just happened. On the drive home, I replayed the evening in my head, every detail somehow worse than the last. The deception, the bombshell confessions, the complete lack of awareness. It all felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I thought about her kids, her husband, her struggles with addiction, and for a brief moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered how she'd lied about everything from the start, and that sympathy evaporated. I deleted her number the moment I got home. Blocked her on the dating app too. I wasn't about to risk her showing up in my inbox months later with some new drama. As far as I was concerned, this chapter was closed. The car ride was the longest, most suffocating silence I've ever endured. The hum of the engine was the only sound, punctuated by the occasional clicking of his turn signal. I stared out the window, watching the darkened streets blur by, fighting the urge to scream just to break the unbearable quiet. He hadn't said a word, not one, in the entire drive. I glanced at him, his hands gripping the wheel at 10 and 2, his face blank, emotionless. No small talk. No had a nice time. Just nothing. It hadn't started this way. When we matched, his messages were normal, friendly even. We'd exchanged some banter, talked about our favorite shows, and landed on dinner for our first date. He wasn't overly chatty, but I figured maybe he was just a little reserved. I thought meeting in person would bring out more of his personality. Instead, it felt like I was sitting across from a statue. From the moment we sat down at the restaurant, I could tell something was off. I started the conversation with something simple. "So, how was your day?" "Fine," he said, then looked down at the menu. I laughed lightly, assuming he'd elaborate, but he didn't. Okay, maybe he was nervous. "What do you do for work?" I asked, trying again. "Tech," he said, not even glancing up. "Tech? Cool. What kind of stuff do you work on?" "Software." I waited for him to say more, but he didn't. Just stared blankly at his menu, like it was the most fascinating thing in the world. By this point, I was starting to panic a little. Maybe I'd done something wrong. Said something that upset him? I ran through our earlier texts in my head, trying to find some clue, but nothing stood out. The waiter came by, and I almost sighed with relief. Finally, someone else to fill the silence. But after we ordered, the quiet settled back in like a heavy fog. I asked more questions, hoping to coax something out of him. "What do you like to do for fun?" "Movies. Seen anything good lately?" "No, so, any siblings?" "Yeah." It was like pulling teeth, except I was the only one in pain. Eventually I stopped trying. What was the point? He clearly wasn't interested in talking to me, or anyone apparently. We ate in total silence. The clinking of silverware on plates was the only sound between us, and every time I looked up, he was either staring off into the distance or focused intently on his food. At one point, the awkwardness became too much, and I started laughing, this nervous, uncontrollable giggle I couldn't suppress. I expected him to at least ask why I was laughing, but he didn't even blink. He just kept eating, like I wasn't even there. I felt trapped, like I was stuck in a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. The silence wasn't just uncomfortable, it was oppressive, like it was swallowing me whole. I could feel my pulse quickening, my palms sweating, and I started to wonder if maybe this wasn't just a bad date. Maybe something was seriously wrong with him. The way he avoided eye contact, the way he didn't react to anything, it was eerie, like I was sitting across from someone who'd forgotten how to be human. When the check came, I almost bolted for the door. But no, I told myself to stick it out. He was my ride home, after all. Maybe the car ride would be better. Maybe he'd relax now that the pressure of the dinner was over. Spoiler alert, it wasn't better. The silence in the car was somehow even worse than at the restaurant. At least in the restaurant, there were other people, background noise, distractions. In the car, it was just us, the hum of the engine, and the suffocating tension. I tried to start a conversation once, just once. "So, do you live far from here?" I asked, my voice thin and strained. "No," he said. I gave up after that. I stared out the window, counting streetlights, counting seconds, counting anything to make the time pass faster. Every now and then, I'd glance over at him, hoping he'd say something, but he never did. His face was completely blank, like he was in some sort of trance. It wasn't just awkward anymore, it was unsettling. I started wondering if I was even safe with him. When we finally pulled up to my apartment, I could feel my body unclench, the tension in my chest easing slightly. "Thanks for the ride," I said, fumbling for the door handle. "Yeah," he said, not even looking at me. I got out of the car as fast as I could, practically sprinting up the steps to my building. I didn't look back. I didn't want to see him just sitting there, staring blankly into the distance. Once I was inside, I locked the door, leaned against it, and let out a long breath. My heart was still racing, and my hands were shaking. The whole evening had felt wrong, like I'd been sitting across from someone who wasn't quite real. I kept replaying the silence in my head, the eerie stillness, the way he seemed completely detached from everything around him. I didn't hear from him again, and I didn't want to. The whole experience left me rattled, like I'd brushed up against something sinister without even realizing it. The rain was relentless, pouring in icy sheets as I stood under the awning of the pizza place, staring at the peeling paint on the door and questioning every decision I'd made that led me here. This was supposed to be a casual, fun first date, the kind where you didn't overthink things. We'd met on OkCupid, exchanged a few messages, and decided on a whim to meet up since we were both bored and had nothing better to do. The plan was simple: grab some pizza, chat, and see if there was anything there. But as soon as we stepped inside, I knew I'd made a mistake. The guy behind the counter looked frazzled and out of place, his apron hanging crookedly, and his expression a mix of panic and apathy. "Hey," he said, barely glancing up, "I'm new here. Running the place by myself. All I can do is heat up the slices the last guy left." I laughed awkwardly, glancing at my date. She smiled politely, but her eyes said everything. Is this normal? I could feel the weight of her unspoken question, and all I could do was shrug. It was cold and rainy outside, and the thought of trudging through the downpour to find somewhere else seemed worse than just toughing it out here. "I guess we'll stay," I said, trying to sound upbeat. We grabbed a booth, and that's when the cracks in my plan started widening. The place was filthy, sticky tables, crumbs scattered across the floor, and a faint smell of something burnt lingering in the air. In the corner, a couple of guys were openly rolling blunts, and at the table nearest ours, a group of kids passed around a pitcher of beer. None of them looked a day over 18. It felt like we'd wandered into a set for one of those gritty indie films where everything goes wrong. The pizza, when it came, was edible. That's about all I can say for it. But the food wasn't the worst part. The worst part was me. I was hyper-aware of how badly I'd screwed up. This wasn't just a bad choice of venue. It was the bad choice, the kind that eats away at you in real time. She deserved better than this dive, and I couldn't stop fixating on how much I'd blown it. Every time I tried to start a conversation, my awkwardness choked the life out of it. "So," I said, staring at her across the greasy table, "what made you move here?" She smiled, soft and genuine, and started talking about her job, her love for exploring new places, how she didn't know many people here yet. She was smart, thoughtful, and easy to talk to on paper. But I couldn't get out of my own head long enough to let the conversation flow. Every word I said felt clunky, forced, like I was trying too hard and failing miserably. The sound of laughter from the beer-drinking teens cut through the tension. I glanced over at them, their carefree energy a sharp contrast to the awkward silence settling between us. I forced a laugh, gesturing vaguely at the scene around us. "This place isn't exactly how I remember it," I said, hoping humor might save me. She chuckled, a small mercy. "Yeah, it's definitely unique." We finished our food quickly, more out of a desire to escape than anything else. As we stepped outside, the rain was still coming down hard, and I offered to walk her to her car. The whole way, I replayed the night in my head, cringing at every awkward pause, every missed opportunity to make her laugh or show her who I really was. When we reached her car, I forced a smile. "Well, thanks for tonight." "Thanks," she said, her voice kind but non-committal. "Take care." I watched her drive away, knowing I'd never see her again. That was it. I'd blown it. I walked back to my car in the rain, defeated, and went home to sulk. For weeks, I replayed the disaster of that date in my mind. Every time I thought about her, her smile, her easy laugh, the way she'd tried to make the best of an undeniably bad situation, I felt a pang of regret. I told myself to forget about her, to move on, but she lingered in the back of my mind like a ghost. And then, out of nowhere, I got the nerve to message her. I don't know what possessed me. Maybe it was the lingering guilt, or maybe I just needed closure. "Hey," I wrote, "I know our first date wasn't great, but if you'd be up for a do-over, I'd love a chance to show you a better time." To my shock, she said yes. The second date was nothing like the first. I took her to my favorite pizza place, the tiny one I should have picked the first time, with its cozy atmosphere and incredible food. We laughed until our sides hurt, the conversation flowing effortlessly. It was like night and day compared to our first meeting, and for the first time, I felt like I could breathe around her. Fast forward 4 years, and here I am, writing this while she sleeps next to me in our apartment. Our cat is curled up at her feet, purring softly. That disastrous first date feels like a lifetime ago, and yet, it's a part of our story, a reminder of how far we've come. The night started off like a typical Saturday. I was pumped for what I thought was going to be an epic party. A band, good vibes, and a chance to get to know this girl I'd met at the bar a few days earlier. We'd hit it off then, swapping numbers and trading laughs. When she invited me to a party at her dad's house, I thought, sure, why not? She made it sound like a wild time. But as I pulled up to the house, the red flags started waving. Hard. The driveway had maybe 4 cars parked in it, and the house was quiet. No music, no sounds of laughter or people mingling. Just the faint buzz of streetlights in the chilly air. I hesitated, staring at the house, debating whether to turn around. But I was already here, so I told myself to give it a shot. What's the worst that could happen? I thought. A question I would come to regret. She opened the door before I even knocked, and it was immediately clear she was trashed. Her eyes were glassy, her movements wobbly, and she greeted me with a slurred, overly enthusiastic, "You made it." She pulled me inside, babbling about how amazing the party was going to be, and dragged me down into the basement. The party was a joke. The band she'd hyped up. That was just her dad, awkwardly strumming a beat-up guitar in the corner. A couple of people sat slumped on mismatched couches, barely acknowledging my existence. The place reeked of stale beer and something sour. I grabbed a drink just to have something to hold, already plotting my exit. Then things got weirder. She kept disappearing into the bathroom with her friend, coming out jittery, rubbing her nose, and giggling like a maniac. It didn't take a genius to figure out they were doing coke in there. Her dad, meanwhile, kept yammering about some guy named Pee Wee Johnson, who was apparently dying to meet me. I nodded along, not really caring, just wanting to find the right moment to bail. Suddenly, her dad sprinted upstairs. "He's here," he shouted. "Pee Wee's here." I froze. Who the hell was Pee Wee Johnson, and why was her dad so excited? Before I could process, he came back down the stairs, completely naked. Yes, you read that right. Naked. Except, he wasn't just naked. He was wearing some grotesque prosthetic contraption that made him look like he had 3 oversized breasts on his chest, a 4th dangling somewhere below his stomach, along with massive fake testicles and a disturbingly small fake penis. My jaw hit the floor. This grown man, her father, strutted across the room, climbed onto the makeshift stage, and started singing again, still in his bizarre naked getup. The 2 other guests clapped half-heartedly while I sat there, stunned into silence. What kind of fever dream had I walked into? My brain screamed at me to leave, but my date was nowhere to be seen. I figured I should at least find her before I ghosted. I wandered upstairs and found her in a bedroom, hunched over a trash can, puking her guts out. She was a mess, hair matted to her sweaty forehead, mumbling incoherently. Despite the absolute disaster this night had turned into, I couldn't just leave her like that. I helped her onto the bed, propped her up, and put the trash can within reach. I stayed for a bit, making sure she wouldn't choke or something, but it was clear she was out for the count. That's when the next curveball hit. Out of nowhere, a 12-year-old girl walked into the room. She was carrying a soda and looked far too comfortable with the chaos unfolding around her. I blinked, trying to make sense of it. "Who are you?" I asked. "My sister," she said flatly, motioning toward my passed-out date. Her sister. A child was wandering around in this circus of a house while her dad was downstairs naked and her older sibling was coked out and unconscious. It was surreal. I wasn't sure whether to be horrified or impressed by how unfazed this kid seemed. We ended up talking. Turns out she was into martial arts, and as a heavyweight champ at the time, we had a surprising amount in common. We talked about competitions, training, and even realized we knew a few of the same people in the scene. For a moment, it was almost normal, 2 strangers bonding over a shared passion. Except one of us was a kid, and the other was supposed to be on a date with her sister. Eventually, I glanced at my watch and decided I'd had enough. This wasn't just a bad date, it was a full-blown horror show, and I needed to get out. I stood up, gesturing toward my unconscious date. "Be smart," I told her little sister, nodding toward the bed. "Don't end up like this." The kid nodded solemnly, and I walked out the door, the sounds of her dad's off-key singing still echoing through the house as I escaped into the night. Driving home, I replayed the night in my head, equal parts horrified and baffled. How had it gone so wrong so quickly? What kind of life was this girl living, surrounded by drugs, chaos, and a father who thought stripping down and performing was acceptable party behavior? I never called her again. Never saw her again. The highway stretched out before us, endless and unforgiving, as I gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. His words echoed in my head, each one cutting deeper than the last. "Well, you're no Miss America, but you'll do." I laughed it off at first, the kind of awkward laugh you let out when you're caught off guard and unsure how to respond. But the sting of those words lingered, sour and humiliating. I glanced over at him in the passenger seat, his smug expression illuminated by the early morning sun. He didn't even seem to notice how cruel he'd been, like it was just another joke, another throwaway comment. But to me, it set the tone for what would become the worst and most unsettling date of my life. This was supposed to be a fun day. A blind date, sure, but the idea of spending a sunny afternoon at the beach sounded like a perfect escape from the grind of college life. I'd agreed to pick him up since he didn't have a car. Seemed harmless enough at the time. But 15 minutes into the drive, I already regretted my decision. His tone was sharp, his comments laced with an edge that made my skin crawl. What had started as awkward small talk quickly devolved into something darker. He had this way of steering the conversation toward topics designed to make me uncomfortable, mocking people's appearances, cracking mean-spirited jokes, and acting like he was the smartest guy in the room. And then there was that comment. The one about Miss America. I could still feel the knot in my stomach, twisting tighter with every mile. There was no turning back, though. We were on the highway, and the beach was still an hour away. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to tough it out. Maybe the beach would improve his mood, or at least give me enough space to breathe and collect myself. But as the minutes dragged on, it became painfully clear. He wasn't going to get better. In fact, he was only getting worse. At one point, he turned to me, completely serious, and asked, "Do you always wear your hair like that?" "It's interesting." I bit my tongue, refusing to rise to the bait. But inside, I was boiling. Who's this guy? And why did he think he had the right to talk to me like that? The silence between us grew heavier as I stopped trying to make conversation. I focused on the road, counting the miles until the next rest area. I needed a break, not just from driving, but from him. When we finally pulled into one, the tension in the car was unbearable. "I'm going to use the restroom," he announced, grabbing his bag and slamming the door shut behind him. The moment he disappeared into the building, something in me snapped. I glanced at his stuff, his jacket, a small bag he'd left behind, and an idea took root. A wild, impulsive, and completely freeing idea. I don't have to do this. I don't owe him my time or my patience. I can end this right now. Before I could talk myself out of it, I grabbed his things, opened the car door, and dumped them on the curb. My heart raced as I climbed back into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and started the engine. I didn't even look back as I pulled out of the lot and onto the highway. For the first few miles, my hands were shaking. Adrenaline coursed through me, a mix of panic and exhilaration. What if he tried to call me? What if he somehow found a way to track me down? I shoved the thoughts aside, focusing instead on the relief of being free from his toxic presence. By the time I made it home, the initial panic had worn off, replaced by a quiet sense of triumph. Sure, the day hadn't gone as planned, but I'd stood up for myself in a way I never had before. I'd taken control of a situation that could have easily spiraled into something worse. Even now, decades later, I still think about that day. Not just about how awful he was, but about how close I came to tolerating it, to letting his behavior slide just because I didn't want to seem rude or overreact. It's a reminder that sometimes, the scariest moments aren't the ones where someone threatens you outright. They're the moments where someone chips away at your self-worth piece by piece, until you start to question if you deserve better. The wine glass trembled slightly in my hand as I glanced across the table. Her expression was neutral, polite, but completely detached. The air between us felt heavy, like we were both trapped in some awkward social experiment with no escape hatch. I swirled the wine, took a sip, and forced myself to keep the conversation going. "So," I ventured, "what made you get into accounting?" She blinked at me, her response quick and clipped, like she was reciting a fact from a script. "It's stable, and I'm good with numbers." "Oh," I said, nodding as if that was a deeply profound answer. The silence returned, thick and suffocating, like a third presence at the table. I felt my grip on small talk slipping, my dating skills eroded from years of avoiding anything resembling intimacy after my last breakup. And yet, I couldn't shake the growing dread that this wasn't just me. We were both awful at this. Our earlier dinner had been a disaster too. Every question we asked each other felt more like an obligation than genuine curiosity. It wasn't just her giving short answers. I was just as guilty. It was like we were locked in a timed debate, rushing through the motions without any real interest in each other. I knew there was no spark, no chemistry. Hell, there wasn't even a flicker. Still, I felt compelled to salvage something from the night. Dessert and wine? I'd suggested after dinner, desperate to loosen up the tension, or at least make the date slightly more bearable. She agreed, and I held on to the faint hope that maybe, the atmosphere would help. Spoiler, it didn't. I loosened up a bit, sure. The wine helped me lean into my stories, my jokes. But no matter what I said, her reaction remained non-existent. She'd nod, maybe chuckle politely, but there was nothing behind it. Meanwhile, I was drowning in my own awkwardness, desperately trying to claw my way out of this pit of social hell. When she excused herself to go to the bathroom, I slumped forward, resting my head on the table. I could practically feel the weight of my failure pressing down on me. That's when I felt it, a light touch on my arm. Startled, I looked up to see one of the girls sitting at the table next to ours. She was smiling, her friend giggling beside her. "You're doing great," she whispered, trying not to laugh. "We've been listening, and honestly, you're really funny." "She's just not getting it." I blinked, completely caught off guard. For the first time all night, I felt seen, like someone understood the effort I was putting in. "Thanks," I said, managing a weak smile. "I'm trying." The three of us started chatting quietly, their laughter a stark contrast to the suffocating silence I'd endured with my date. I told them one of the jokes that had fallen flat earlier, and they cracked up, their laughter drawing a warmth I hadn't felt all evening. For a brief, fleeting moment, I didn't feel like a complete disaster. Of course, that's when my date returned. She stopped mid-stride, her eyes narrowing as she took in the scene, me, laughing with two strangers while she'd been gone. The awkwardness snapped back into place, tighter than ever, and I straightened up, fumbling to explain. But she didn't say a word. She just sat down, her expression icy, and the silence roared back to life. When the check came, I reached for it, ready to put this night to bed. But before I could grab it, she snatched it out of my hand, her movements sharp and deliberate. "We'll split it," she said firmly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "A girl can pay her own way." I blinked, stunned, then caught the eyes of the girls at the next table. They exchanged a glance, their expressions a mix of disbelief and sympathy. One of them raised her eyebrows at me as if to say, "You're not the problem here." We paid the bill in tense silence, and I followed her out the door, dragging my feet like a condemned man heading to the gallows. The girls behind me offered a small look of encouragement as we left, but it wasn't enough to lighten the weight of the evening. I walked her to the train station, feeling like I was escorting a stranger rather than someone I'd just spent the last few hours with. The night air was cold, but the distance between us felt colder. When we reached the platform, I didn't even bother offering to wait with her. She probably didn't want me there, and honestly, I figured she'd enjoy the wait more without me. As we said goodbye, an awkward, fumbling handshake that felt more like closing a business deal than ending a date, I couldn't muster up the energy to care. We parted ways without a second glance, the silent agreement between us clear. This was the last time we'd ever see each other. On the train ride home, I opened the comic books I'd bought earlier that day, hoping they'd redeem the trip into the city. But as I flipped through the pages, I couldn't stop my mind from wandering back to the wine bar, to the girls at the next table, to the laughter and connection I'd managed to find in the middle of an otherwise disastrous evening. I should have gone back, I realized. After I dropped her off, I should have turned around, walked back into the bar, and joined their table. Anything would have been better than letting the night end like this, flat, awkward, and utterly forgettable. Or maybe not forgettable. Because even now, I can't help but think about that date, the way it felt like we were two strangers forced together by circumstance, both silently counting the minutes until it was over. The way the laughter from the next table seemed to taunt me, a reminder of what connection could feel like if only it wasn't so painfully absent. The waiter had barely stepped away when she started crying, full on, head in her hands, can't catch her breath crying. I froze, unsure if I'd accidentally said something offensive in the last 30 seconds. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice laced with panic. She sniffled, wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, and blurted out, "It's just, me and my ex-boyfriend used to order the same thing." I blinked. Slowly. She was crying because I ordered water, and she got a Coke. The same drinks she and her ex used to get. My brain scrambled for an appropriate response. But what do you even say to that? I'm sorry." She shook her head furiously, tears streaming down her face. It's not your fault, she sobbed. I just didn't expect it to hit me this hard. Hit her this hard? Over beverages? I stared down at the untouched glass of water in front of me, suddenly feeling like it was radioactive. I glanced around the restaurant, hoping no one was watching, but it felt like every eye in the place was on us. Hey, it's okay, I said awkwardly, wishing I could melt into my chair. You don't have to think about him. Let's just enjoy the meal. But that was easier said than done. She was inconsolable, sniffling through the appetizer and clutching a napkin like it was her lifeline. The more I tried to cheer her up, the worse it seemed to get. She kept looking at me with these big, watery eyes, like she thought I might vanish into thin air at any second. Then came the paranoia. Promise me you're not going to leave, she said out of nowhere, her voice trembling. When I go to the bathroom, you won't just walk out, right? Her words hit me like a slap. What? I asked, genuinely startled. Why would I do that? Guys do that to me sometimes, she whispered, her gaze dropping to the table. They just leave. My stomach twisted. On one hand, I felt bad for her, really bad. She clearly had been through some stuff. But on the other hand, I couldn't ignore the weight of what she'd just said. Guys had walked out on her mid-date. What kind of disaster dates had she been on to make her think that was a real possibility? More importantly, what did that say about how this night was going? I'm not going anywhere, I said firmly, trying to reassure her. She nodded, but I could tell she didn't fully believe me. She went to the bathroom, and for the few minutes she was gone, I sat frozen at the table, acutely aware of the stares from the nearby tables. The weight of her earlier comment hung in the air. I'd promised I wouldn't leave, and I meant it, but there was a tiny, nagging part of me that wondered if I should have. What have I gotten myself into? When she came back, her mood had shifted. The tears were gone, replaced by an odd sort of manic energy. She sat down, leaned in close, and said, "Do you want to go to the mall after this?" I frowned, confused. "The mall?" She nodded, her eyes wide and almost excited. "There's a piercing place there. I've been thinking about getting my nipples done." My brain short-circuited. Nipples? I could barely process what was happening. Wow, I managed to stammer. "That's bold. You'll come with me, right?" she asked, smiling now. It was the first time all night she didn't look like she was about to cry, but the sudden shift was almost more unsettling. "I don't know if that's really my scene," I said cautiously. I was already mentally preparing my exit plan, but she wasn't listening. She was too busy talking about how much it would hurt, or not hurt, and whether I thought a barbell or hoops would look better. I nodded along, trying to keep up, but my mind was racing. This wasn't just an awkward date anymore. It was something else entirely, something I didn't have the tools to handle. The crying, the paranoia, the nipple-piercing detour. What was next? When the check came, I grabbed it, hoping to wrap this up as quickly as possible. "Let me take care of this," I said, trying to sound polite. "No," she said sharply, snatching the check out of my hand. "A girl can pay her own way." I didn't argue. At that point, I was just grateful for anything that sped up the process of ending this bizarre, emotionally charged evening. We walked out together, the air between us heavy with unspoken weirdness. She looked up at me expectantly as we reached the sidewalk, and I realized with a sinking feeling that she was waiting for me to suggest we head to the mall. Instead, I gestured toward the parking lot. "Your car's this way, right?" "Oh," she said, clearly disappointed. "Yeah, I guess." I walked her to her car, doing my best to keep the mood light. When we got there, she turned to me, hesitating as if she wanted to say something profound. I braced myself, but all she managed was a quiet, "Thanks for tonight." "Of course," I said quickly, stepping back. "Take care." She drove off, and I stood there for a moment, letting the tension drain from my shoulders. The relief was almost overwhelming. I climbed into my own car, sat in silence for a moment, and then laughed, this incredulous, shaky laugh that came from pure disbelief. "What was that?" The first thing I noticed was the suit. A full suit, for a casual 5:30 p.m. tea date. My brain stalled as he walked toward me, but then my eyes drifted downward, and things got worse. He wasn't wearing normal shoes. No, he had on those weird barefoot shoes, the kind that hug each toe like gloves. And strapped around his waist, a fanny pack. By the time I got to his face, I was greeted by oversized, reflective bike glasses that made him look like a wannabe marathoner trapped in a business meeting. "Hey," he said, grinning like nothing about this situation was out of the ordinary. "Hi," I replied, trying to keep my expression neutral. My fight-or-flight instincts were already kicking in, but I forced myself to sit down. Maybe it was just a quirky first impression. Maybe he had some reason for the ensemble that would make it less horrifying. Spoiler alert, he didn't. As soon as we settled in with our tea, he launched into a monologue about his job. Not the usual polite small talk, mind you. This was an unfiltered rant. He hated his boss. He hated his coworkers. He hated the office. He hated the commute. It was like he'd been bottling up his frustrations for years and had decided I, a stranger, would be the perfect outlet. I tried to steer the conversation into safer waters. So, do you have any hobbies? I asked, attempting to sound cheerful. Running, he said, his tone completely flat. No elaboration, no enthusiasm, just a single lifeless word. Then, as if realizing he should say more, he added, I run every day. Keeps me sane. Oh, that's cool, I said, trying to keep things going. Have you done any marathons? He shrugged, sipping his tea. Yeah, a few. But those are nothing. I prefer long solo runs, pushing myself. I nodded, hoping he'd take the hint to ask me something. But instead, he launched back into complaining about his job. I stared at him, trying to stay engaged, but my mind kept wandering back to the outfit. The suit and barefoot shoes alone were enough to throw me off, but the fanny pack? Was he carrying something important? Snacks? Pepper spray? Why would someone need a fanny pack for tea? And the glasses? Did he think we'd be riding off into the sunset after this? The whole scene felt surreal, like I'd wandered into a fever dream. His voice droned on and on about how his boss didn't appreciate him, how his co-workers were idiots, and how he was planning to quit any day now. The more he talked, the more I realized there was no saving this date. I glanced at my watch, desperately trying to come up with an excuse to leave. Before I could say anything, he leaned back in his chair and said, I think I'm going to go for a run after this. Oh, I asked, confused. Yeah, he said, gesturing to his suit. 12 miles. I'll just run in this. He said it like it was the most normal thing in the world, like running in a suit was a totally acceptable thing to do. I blinked, waiting for him to laugh, to reveal that he was joking. But he didn't. He just sat there, completely serious. It's good training, he added, as if that explained everything. My brain couldn't process it. The barefoot shoes I could understand for running. But the suit? Was this some kind of flex? Was he trying to impress me by proving how tough or quirky he was? If that was the goal, it wasn't working. That's, ambitious, I said finally, not knowing what else to say. Yeah, he said, nodding. Most people don't get it, but I'm used to being misunderstood. At that moment, I decided I'd had enough. I forced a smile and said, I have an early morning tomorrow. I should probably get going. He looked disappointed but nodded. Sure, no problem. I'll just head out for my run. I stared at him, half expecting him to rip off the suit and reveal running shorts underneath. But no, he stood up, adjusted his fanny pack, and started stretching in the tea shop. People were staring, and I felt my face flush with second-hand embarrassment. Good luck, I said quickly, grabbing my bag and heading for the door before he could rope me into watching his pre-run routine. As I walked to my car, I kept replaying the evening in my head, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The outfit, the ranting, the casual declaration of a 12-mile run in formal wear. It was all so bizarre, like a parody of a bad date. I couldn't stop wondering, was this who he really was, or was this some kind of elaborate social experiment? Either way, I knew one thing for sure. There wouldn't be a second date. The bar was dimly lit, with the low hum of chatter and clinking glasses setting the mood. I leaned back in my chair, holding my drink, and tried to make sense of what I'd just heard. She had said it so casually, as if we weren't on a date, as if it was something you'd share with a coworker over lunch. I got a booty call before I came here, she'd said, swirling her cocktail with the tiny straw. Her tone was nonchalant, almost bored, but her eyes flicked up to gauge my reaction. I laughed nervously, unsure of how to respond. Oh, well, that's honest, I managed, trying to keep things light. But inside, my ego took a hit. Hard. Who even says that on a date? I brushed it off, forcing myself to focus on the conversation, but the words lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. The night carried on awkwardly. There was some small talk, some surface-level banter, but I couldn't shake the weird energy in the air. She seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else, or with someone else. I chalked it up to nerves or maybe a mismatch in vibes, but something about the whole situation felt off. At one point, she excused herself to use the restroom. Be right back, she said with a quick smile. I nodded, fiddling with the coaster under my drink, trying to convince myself that the night wasn't a total disaster. Maybe I was overthinking it. Maybe I could salvage this. 5 minutes passed. Then 10. Then 15. The awkward pit in my stomach grew heavier as I glanced toward the restroom, then back at her empty chair. I told myself to be patient. Maybe there was a line, or maybe she'd gotten caught up fixing her makeup. But as the minutes dragged on, a sinking feeling crept in. Something wasn't right. Finally, I decided to check. I got up, weaving through the crowded bar toward the restrooms. The hallway was quiet, empty. I waited a moment, then peeked around the corner. No sign of her. I went back to our table, hoping she'd reappeared while I was gone. But the chair was still empty, the air around it cold and vacant. My heart sank as the realization hit me. She was gone. She'd just left. I sat down slowly, staring at the half-empty cocktail she'd left behind. A mix of embarrassment and frustration churned in my chest. Who does that? Who just disappears mid-date without a word? My mind raced through the possibilities. Did I say something wrong? Did she not like me? Or worse, was she bored enough to just ghost me entirely? The bartender passed by, glancing at the empty chair across from me. "Your date leave?" he asked casually. "Yeah," I muttered, forcing a laugh. "Guess so." He gave me a sympathetic nod before walking away, but his pity felt like salt in the wound. I downed the rest of my drink in one gulp, the burn doing little to dull the sting of rejection. As I sat there, the words she'd said earlier replayed in my mind. "I got a booty call before I came here." Was that it? Did someone text her, and she decided they were a better option? Did she leave to meet them? The thought made my stomach twist. I pictured her walking out of the bar, phone in hand, smiling as she texted someone who wasn't me. The image stung more than I cared to admit. This wasn't just a bad date, it was a hit to my pride. A reminder that sometimes, people won't even give you the courtesy of a goodbye. The rest of the night felt like a blur. I paid the tab, grabbed my coat, and walked out into the cold night air, my mind still reeling. The city lights blurred together as I replayed the evening over and over, trying to pinpoint where it all went wrong. But no matter how much I analyzed it, one fact remained: she'd left, and I had no idea why. Even now, thinking back on it, the whole thing feels surreal, like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. Her disappearing act wasn't just rude, it was unsettling. It left me with more questions than answers, and a lingering unease I couldn't shake. Dating is supposed to be awkward, sure. But this? This was something else entirely. A night that started with a casual drink ended with an empty chair, and the kind of silence that sticks with you long after the night is over. The roller rink was alive with neon lights and thumping pop music, the kind of chaotic energy that promised a good time. I stood by the rental counter, lacing up my skates and nervously glancing at my date. He was already wobbling around on his skates like a baby deer, but I chalked it up to nerves or excitement. I mean, it was a cute idea for a first date, right? Fun, nostalgic, low pressure. I smiled at him, trying to ease the awkwardness. "Ready to hit the floor?" I asked, holding out my hand. He grinned back, maybe a little too wide, and we shuffled toward the rink. At first, it was fun. We laughed, stumbled, and leaned on each other as we tried not to fall. He kept cracking jokes, trying to impress me, and for a little while it almost worked. But then, maybe 15 minutes in, his face went pale. Like ghostly pale. "You okay?" I asked, my smile fading. He nodded quickly, too quickly. Yeah, I'm fine," he mumbled, but his hand shot to his stomach, and his expression twisted into something between panic and nausea. Before I could say anything else, he doubled over and, oh my God, threw up. Right there, in the middle of the rink. I jumped back instinctively, but not fast enough. It splashed onto my leg, warm and awful, and I froze in shock. Around us, people gasped and scattered, skaters swerving to avoid the mess. He straightened up, looking horrified, and stammered, "I'm so sorry." I didn't even know what to say. What could I say? My brain was still trying to process what had just happened when he bolted toward the bathroom, one hand clamped over his mouth. I stood there awkwardly, trying to wipe the mess off my leg with a paper napkin someone had handed me. The rink staff came over with a mop, giving me a mix of pitying and annoyed looks. People were staring, whispering, and I wanted to crawl under the neon-patterned carpet and disappear. A few minutes later, he emerged from the bathroom, looking pale and shaky but determined. "I'm so sorry," he said again, his voice cracking. "I don't know what happened. I think I ate something bad. Maybe we should call it a night," I suggested gently, but he shook his head. No, no, I'm fine now, he insisted, forcing a smile. Let's keep skating. I hesitated, but I didn't want to seem rude, so I reluctantly followed him back onto the rink. We made it maybe 2 laps before it happened again. This time, he didn't even make it to the bathroom. He stumbled toward the edge of the rink, clutching his stomach, and vomited all over the floor. And yes, some of it splashed onto me. Again. By this point, I was equal parts horrified and grossed out. He apologized profusely, his voice hoarse, and muttered something about needing to sit down. I helped him to a bench, keeping a cautious distance, and handed him a bottle of water. You really don't look good, I said, trying to be polite while fighting the urge to gag. Maybe you should call someone to pick you up. He nodded weakly, pulling out his phone. I'll call my mom, he mumbled. That's when it hit me. This grown man was about to have his mom come pick him up from our first date. Not that I was judging, given the circumstances, but the situation was spiraling into something out of a comedy horror movie. While we waited, he leaned over and threw up again, barely missing my shoes this time. I jumped back, my patience and sympathy wearing dangerously thin. The staff shot me a look, and I mouthed an apology on his behalf, feeling the embarrassment crawl up my neck. Finally, his mom arrived. She hurried over to him, concern etched across her face, and helped him to his feet. Oh, honey, you look terrible, she said, wrapping an arm around him. And then, as if the night hadn't been bad enough, he leaned toward her and, vomited on her. I stood there, frozen, watching as she gasped and tried to console him while wiping herself off. It was like a slow-motion car crash I couldn't look away from. I knew I should have stepped in, offered to help something, but at that moment, all I wanted to do was run. Thank you for taking care of him, she said to me, clearly trying to keep her composure. I nodded mutely, my voice caught somewhere between an apology and an explanation that I was never going to see him again. He looked at me one last time, his face a mix of gratitude and humiliation. I'm so sorry, he croaked, before his mom led him out the door. I stayed behind for a few minutes, partly to compose myself and partly to avoid having to share an elevator with them. When I finally left, the cold night air hit me like a blessing, washing away the stale, nauseating smells of the roller rink. As I walked to my car, I replayed the night in my head, equal parts horrified and incredulous. It wasn't just a bad date, it was a legendary disaster, the kind of night that doesn't just go wrong but collapses into utter chaos. The air in the brewhouse was warm and inviting, the soft hum of conversation mixing with the faint clinking of glasses. It was the perfect setting for a first date, or so I thought. I sat at the small corner table, nerves buzzing but hopeful, sipping on a pint and glancing at the door every so often. After weeks of chatting on Snapchat, this was finally happening. I was excited, maybe even too much so, but who could blame me? He'd seemed funny, engaging, and charming enough to lure me into giving him a chance. Then he walked in. The first thing I noticed was the sway in his step. My stomach sank. He wasn't just tipsy, he was drunk. He spotted me, grinning like he'd already won me over, and staggered toward the table. Hey there, he slurred, dropping into the seat across from me. The smell of cheap whiskey hit me like a wall. I forced a smile, trying to hold on to my optimism, but it didn't last long. You're gonna be fun, he said, leering as his eyes darted to my chest. Short and stacked, huh? You're like a walking tit job. I froze, my mind scrambling to process what he'd just said. Was he joking? He had to be joking. My cheeks burned with embarrassment as I glanced around the bar, praying no one had overheard. I'm sorry, what? I asked, hoping he'd realize how inappropriate he was being. He just laughed, like he thought it was the best compliment in the world. Come on, it's a good thing. You know that was strike one. I took a long sip of my beer, debating whether I should just leave then and there, but I decided to give him one more chance. Maybe he'd sober up a little. Maybe I could steer the conversation into safer territory. Maybe this wasn't a complete train wreck. But then the shouting started. A loud screech of tires echoed from outside, followed by the unmistakable crunch of a fender bender. Everyone in the bar turned to look, craning their necks to see the minor accident unfolding just beyond the front window. Most people muttered things like oof or that sucks. Not him. No, he decided to yell, loud enough for the whole bar to hear, a string of anti-Asian slurs that left me mortified. The room went silent for a beat, all eyes turning toward our table. I wanted to disappear, to melt into my chair and vanish. Jesus Christ, I hissed under my breath. What's wrong with you? What? He said, grinning as if he'd just said something clever. It's funny. It wasn't. Not even a little. That was strike two. Desperate to shift gears, I asked about his day, anything to drown out the echo of his disgusting outburst. But if I thought the topic would lead us into calmer waters, I was dead wrong. He launched into a detailed description of his morning bowel movements, complete with graphic commentary about the liquidity and consistency. My stomach churned as he continued, completely oblivious to how wildly inappropriate it was. And then he shifted to another topic, as if that weren't bad enough. "You want to know the craziest thing I've ever done?" he asked, leaning in like he was about to share a deep, dark secret. "No," I said, but he didn't care. "My first time going down on a girl, she was on her period," he said, grinning as if this was somehow charming. "It was messy. But, you gotta do what you gotta do." I stared at him, horrified. Was this real? Was I actually sitting here, listening to this guy share this level of detail on a first date? My appetite evaporated, replaced by a cold, creeping sense of dread. "Strike 3. No, strike 10. I think I'm gonna call it a night," I said abruptly, standing up and grabbing my bag. He looked up at me, his grin fading. "What? Already?" "Yeah," I said firmly, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't working." And that's when he snapped. "You're kidding me," he said, his voice rising. "You're seriously leaving? After all this?" "Yes," I said, turning toward the door. "Unbelievable," he shouted, loud enough for half the bar to hear. "You're just like every other stuck-up girl. You think you're too good, huh?" I didn't respond. I just walked out, my heart pounding as I made my way to my car. Even as I climbed into the driver's seat, his words rang in my ears. I locked the doors and sat there for a moment, trying to steady my breathing, the adrenaline making my hands shake. The evening started out ordinary enough. I'd agreed to meet him for dinner after chatting online for a while. He seemed normal, funny, polite, even charming in his messages. I had no reason to expect anything weird. But by the end of the night, I'd lost more than my faith in dating. I'd lost my shoe. We met at a cozy little restaurant, the kind of place where the lighting is soft and the music is just loud enough to drown out awkward silences. At first, everything seemed fine. We exchanged the usual pleasantries, ordered our meals, and settled into conversation. He was a bit quirky, sure, but nothing alarming. Just unique. Then it happened. It was somewhere between finishing our appetizers and waiting for the mains. I remember laughing at something he said, some awkward joke about how hard it was to parallel park outside, and then, out of nowhere, he leaned down and grabbed my foot under the table. At first, I froze, not sure if this was some kind of joke. "What are you doing?" I asked, laughing nervously. "Just checking something," he said, his tone casual, like this was the most normal thing in the world. Before I could process what was happening, he slipped off my shoe. My stomach tightened. "Okay, funny," I said, reaching down to take it back. But instead of handing it over, he straightened up, clutching my shoe in his hand like a prize. And then, without a word, he stood up and walked away. I blinked, stunned, as he weaved through the tables, my shoe dangling from his hand. At first, I thought he was kidding, that he was just being weirdly playful and would come right back. But then he didn't. I watched in disbelief as he headed toward the door, still holding my shoe. "Is this real?" I muttered to myself, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "You're on camera. It's a prank." But no one did. The seconds stretched into minutes, and I sat there, one foot bare, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Did he leave? With my shoe? Who does that? My face burned with embarrassment as the waiter approached to refill my water. I pulled my leg under the table, hoping he wouldn't notice my awkward situation. "Everything okay?" the waiter asked, his tone polite but curious. Yeah," I lied, forcing a smile. "Just fine." But it wasn't fine. Nothing about this was fine. My date had just walked out of the restaurant, with my shoe, and left me sitting there like an idiot. After a few more minutes of waiting, because apparently I still had hope at that point, I finally accepted the truth. He wasn't coming back. I paid the bill. Yes, I paid, and hobbled out of the restaurant, one foot still bare, trying to hold on to what little dignity I had left. I called a friend to pick me up, and when I explained what had happened, she burst out laughing. Wait, she said between gasps. "He stole your shoe?" "Yes," I said, my voice dripping with defeat. "He took my shoe. Just one. And he ran away with it." "Why?" she asked, still laughing. "What does he even want with one shoe?" That was the million-dollar question. I replayed the moment over and over in my head during the drive home, trying to make sense of it. Did he have some kind of shoe fetish? Was this a bizarre power move? Or was he just completely unhinged? None of it made sense, and the more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. I never heard from him again. No text, no explanation, nothing. It was like he'd disappeared into the night with my shoe, leaving me with only questions and a weird story to tell. But even now, years later, the whole thing still sticks with me. There was something so eerie about the way he just took it. The way he didn't laugh or act like it was a joke. He just walked away. It wasn't just rude, it was unnerving. And the fact that I never got an explanation makes it even worse. I've had bad dates before, plenty in fact, but this one is burned into my memory as one of the strangest and most unsettling. It wasn't just a bad date. It was a weird date, the kind of experience that leaves you questioning your instincts and wondering what kind of people are really out there.